Great. So in this last session, I have only really a few more bits and pieces to talk through in terms of prepared material. We have a good number of questions in the Google Doc document, which I've again put the link to that into the chat. So do go to that and add +1s for things you want to know about, or add additional questions for things that are not one of those 50-odd questions that are in that Google document. I'll be taking hopefully only about 15 minutes to 20 minutes or so to cover the rest of the material I have in this PowerPoint, and then I'll go through the list of questions in the document in order of how popular they were, to cover off on topics that I don't think, or where I have some more opinions to offer you. Okay, so hopefully that's where things will stand at the end of today. Quick recap on responding to reviewers. We spent last session thinking for the whole session really about responding to reviewers and some of the kind of tricks and tips around doing that. And just to refresh you, we had, we went through these sort of 6 principles or key aspects of how to write effective responses to reviewers and how to effectively change things in your manuscript. We talked about always being polite, even when reviewers or the review process has been impolite or unfair or disrespectful for you. Try to reciprocate with politeness and respect. There may be some very rare circumstances where a complaint to a journal is warranted. If that's needed, perhaps leave that till after the review process has been concluded, and perhaps ask one of the senior co-authors or colleagues involved to really sort of help you with that and to guide you. Responses to reviews and implicitly the revision of manuscripts themselves needs to be completely thorough. Don't try to cut corners, you'll be caught out, and it will increase your chance of being rejected. Being rejected after revision is pretty common. It does happen quite a lot. So don't assume that just because you've got what appear to be quite minor revisions, do not make the mistake of assuming that you're already successful. I've seen some real surprises right at the last minute, so watch out. Be honest, both in what you can change and what you can't change, and what you want to change and what you don't want to change. Just be honest about it. Don't try to cover up or pull the wool over the eyes of the reviewers or editors. Be brief as far as possible in your responses that you make to comments. Remember, we covered that point. Importantly, don't create new arguments and discussions and bring in new things in your responses. Try to make a change in your manuscript and close down the discussion. Don't open up discussion. If editors see arguments developing and discussions deepening, that's not a good sign. They want to see discussions closing down, issues being resolved, and consensus emerging. And you need to do everything you can to make your responses as brief and conclusive and final as possible. Change something in the manuscript in response to everything that reviewers say. And that's really important. Don't sweat the small stuff. And I'll show you a couple of examples of that in a moment in some real responses to reviewers that I've been involved with. Just do it, even if you don't think it's, that big a deal, or you don't really want to change something. Do you need to die in a ditch over that? Is it, choose your battles very carefully. I think that's really important. Okay, so it's a few general tips, and obviously much more elaboration in session 5, which will be up on YouTube soon. I haven't put it up just yet. Okay. So I've got a couple of screens where hopefully I'm allowed to do this anyway. These are reviewer comments from one of our papers. I think they're all online anyway. Now the paper's published. This is sort of typical dialogue, right, for reviewer comments and responses to those reviewer comments. So take a look at the first one. It says, consider referencing an article. Now, I'm making no comments about this article. I can't remember what the article is. Now, there are several circumstances that could happen when you see this. You see this quite a lot. So reviewers saying, hey, what about this paper? And I'm not referring to this particular example, but there, you know, sometimes you think, you know what, I just don't think that's relevant, or I don't think that paper is appropriate for that particular point in the paper, and so on and so on. You just don't, you know, you don't want to cite it or whatever. That's a real case where you have to ask yourself, is it worth me refusing to do that? Everything I refuse to do in my response is going to use up a little bit of the reservoir of goodwill that all the parties involved in this revision have, right? Reviewers, subject editors, associate editors, editors-in-chief, right? The more arguments you have, the more things you refuse to do, the less helpful you're going to appear to be. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that you sacrifice your principles and you do something which you believe to be wrong simply to satisfy what a reviewer says. I'm not suggesting that. What I am suggesting is that you try as hard as you possibly can to positively deal with the comments that you've been given. So maybe you don't feel that citing a particular paper at that point is the right thing to do. Could you cite the same paper somewhere else in your manuscript, for example? Could you cite another similar paper to that one that makes that point? Could you cite a paper that maybe isn't that one, but is a different paper, but that you think does properly match the point being made there? If you see what I mean, there's many ways of thinking around what these suggestions are. So instead of writing, no, we don't want to cite that paper there, and then moving on to the next comment, just think about something you can do, right? In this particular case, we chose to add that reference to there. Perhaps it's a paper we'd either overlooked, or we, you know, often space is very tight in manuscripts and you can't cite all the papers you would want. But when a reviewer asks you to do it, often you have a little bit more latitude and you can add more papers in that you wouldn't initially have been allowed to include because of referencing limits and so on. In this case, we chose to just do it. In other cases, I've maybe taken one of the other approaches that I just described. So here's a real concrete example of, you know, how to try to do something positive and answer in a positive way for something that's a relatively minor point being made by a referee. Okay, so that's one kind of thing that referees might ask us to do. You don't need to understand, of course, or get into any of the detail in what all these words are all about. But the comment marked number 3 on this list, the lines 66 and 68. What's happening in this comment is that the reviewer has made a very astute observation that there's a sort of possible wrinkle in the analysis that could affect the results and the interpretation of the results. And often you get a comment like this and you think, oh, your heart sinks in a way because you know the referee's right. And you also know in your heart of hearts, it's going to involve quite a lot of work to actually fully investigate and address that issue. This is very common in papers, in reviews, that you'll get something like this, where the reviewer's made a good point. And part of you wants to just get this thing done and just try and argue it somehow. And just say, look, oh, you know, we just don't think the patch size thing's a big issue or whatever, and just try to argue your way out of it. Again, I refer you to the principles we talked about just now. Choose your battles carefully. Do something positive. You know, do you really have to argue against or sort of reject out of hand the comment that's been made? In this case, this was for a higher impact journal, you know, and again, referring back to that graph I showed of sort of perfectionism, we thought we really have to try absolutely hard. And this is a valid point that the referee has made. We need to work hard and fully address it. So we did a piece of analysis, an additional piece of analysis. It was quite a lot of work. But we felt the point the referee had made was valid, and we wanted to investigate it empirically. And in this case, we added some results into we sort of did the analysis both ways and added some results into the supplementary information. And we emphasised in the response to this particular comment that, you know, either way of doing it made a pretty small difference to the results, right? This type of thing is super common, happens in almost every paper when you get, you know, especially when you get good and useful reviewer comments, which is most of the time. So this is quite a long response. That section begins, we agree that protected area system. That's quite a long response. Often I would recommend writing shorter ones than that. In this case, it was longer because we'd done some reanalysis. We wanted to sort of communicate that. We wanted to communicate that the results were not especially different, but that we now do present those results in the supplementary information. So they're there for everybody to see and to look at. And it now means we've explicitly included this issue in the manuscript. We opened that response to that comment by agreeing, you know, with the sort of point that's being made. We tried to be polite, but we tried to be factual and straightforward. We tried to, you know, we did something. We did, in this case, we did a reanalysis, and we're talking about the change that we've made in the manuscript itself in response to the comment. So we agree with your point, we've made this change, and here's what that change means for our paper. In this case, you know, it hasn't changed, hasn't quantitatively really changed the results or conclusions, or qualitatively changed them, but we've added the results anyway, so readers can see them, right? So that's a kind of structure of a response to a comment that perhaps you might find useful. Look at comment number 4. Again, a much shorter comment, not a particularly big one, but just another example of how to keep things really brief. So instead of engaging in a discussion now on this point, the referees asked how many species have blah, blah, blah. So they're sort of asking a kind of factual question. And instead of, I suppose, going into that in detail in our response, we've simply said we provide the information and provided a line number for where that information is, right? And you might think, oh, that's a bit kind of curt, but it's all to do with this principle of closing down, finalizing, making a change, showing where the change is, and moving on, right? It's a short comment, easily dealt with. There's no need to use more words and more discussion than is absolutely necessary. Reserve the discussion for that previous comment, which is a bigger, more important comment that required us to make a substantial change in the manuscript and could have affected interpretation of the results. That's important. That's the kind of comment that editors are concerned about. They don't really care about the small detailed stuff. So sort of minimize the prominence of that in the document as it comes back. Remember this, you know lots about your paper, you love your paper, you care about your paper a lot. The other people involved in this, reviewers and editors, it's a small part of their life, and they're interested in it, but they need to devote a fairly circumscribed amount of time and effort to it. So help them as much as possible by keeping things focused on what is really important. Crucially also here, always provide explicit line numbers. I think is really important. You don't, I mean, if you don't, some people kind of don't do this. I think it's really important to do it. You have to be able to see the comment, see where the changes have been made in the manuscript, and providing line numbers is a great way of doing that. All of this said, I do recognise people construct these documents in different ways, and I suppose I'm showing you the way that I do it. And that's not to say this is the only way of doing it or the perfect way of doing it, but this is the world according to Fuller, right? This is my suggestions of how I do it. I tend not to repeat verbatim or quote additional paragraphs or additional texts or changes that have been made in the manuscript in the response. To me, that's just doubling up. It's increasing the length of the correspondence. It's increasing the apparent complexity and depth of discussion in the review and response document. To me, I think we should keep it brief. If you want to see, the context of that citation for comment 2, or if you want to see how many species have adequately protected ranges, go and look in the manuscript in line 81. Like, it's right there, but this document is about a response to the comments and saying what's been changed in response to that. It's not, you don't need to open up discussion and continue discussion in here. Okay, whoops. Right, another page of comments from the same document. Here's one where this is perhaps, well, this is slightly different. This is one where we felt there'd been, I guess, some confusion, and we actually needed to push back a little bit or at least explain ourselves a bit more clearly. The referee was asking for a different kind of map. And again, the detail doesn't matter. And we didn't want to do that, and we had some reasons why we didn't want to provide a difference map. Right? So we've explained that. We tried to explain our viewpoint politely, straightforwardly, honestly. We weren't afraid to do more work. That wasn't why we were reluctant to change it. This is where I think the honesty part comes in. If you're just thinking, oh, it'd be so much work to change it, I can't be bothered doing that, and I'm just going to make up an argument why I'm not going to change it, then that's not going to work. You're sort of going to be found out. Here we thought about it carefully. We actually thought, no, but clearly the reason a referee might ask for something like that, we need to explain ourselves a bit more clearly. So again, we've recognised that instead of just arguing back and saying, no, we don't want to do that for this reason, we've actually acknowledged that we need to explain more clearly what we have done and how it can be interpreted, and how it actually fulfills what the referee is trying to get, because clearly we hadn't articulated that properly. And this isn't a case of excessive humility, it's a case of our message hasn't got through properly, so we've made a mistake and we have been imperfect in the way that we've explained ourselves. So we need to be clearer about what the maps do in this particular case. So we've engaged in a bit of discussion about how we think, you know, that first paragraph where we're aiming that discussion at the reviewer and saying, actually, you know, here's the dynamic of our decision around which maps we've chosen to use. And then we've made a change in the manuscript. Even though we didn't want to make the change in the map, we've still made a change in the manuscript. And I think this is important because it sends the signal to the referee that we value the comment that's been made, and we've made a change in the manuscript and decided to, you know, we've actually done something in response to the comment. And in this case, we have actually quoted some of the text that we added into the manuscript because we felt it was absolutely germane at this point for the reviewer to read that text sort of straight away rather than have to scurry around looking for it in the manuscript, because it forms part of our answer to the referee about what the map is about. Okay. We've also added, I think, as another useful little tip, we'll be happy to discuss the presentation of this figure further, right? And what we're really saying is that, you know, if push came to shove, we can change the maps. I mean, this isn't a kind of, it's not a life or death situation for this paper, right? If needed, we can talk about this further. And, you know, it particularly implies that we could talk about this with the editor if they had concerns or viewpoints on how they wanted some of the visual results to be presented. Okay, so you can leave the door open, I think, sometimes for further discussion about something, especially when that's not something that is fundamentally affecting interpretation. You would never say that about some deeper issue that could affect results or discussion. This is purely vision interpretation. Okay. Any more questions at this point as you're thinking about this along with me about reviewer comments? Because I'm going to finish talking about them now. Either raise your hand or type something into chat. Otherwise, I shall move on. Okay. I think everyone's happy. Okay, so finishing off, last couple of slides, you know, assuming all has gone well, you've written a good paper, you've had some reviewer comments, you've dealt with those expertly, the paper's been accepted and published. That's only then the beginning, really, of course, not the end of it. I mentioned early on in this series, and of course many of you will be acutely aware of this, publishing papers alone is necessary but not sufficient for building a strong career building CV. You need citations, and you don't just need citations in a kind of gamified format, like the more citations I can accumulate, the better. It's deeper than that. You want people to read your work. You want to actually have some influence in the scientific community with other scientists. You want them to appreciate and read and understand and value and use your work, right? Citations is one, albeit imperfect, metric of that. And, you know, by and large, I think citations are a useful measure. It's not the be all and end all. Sometimes influential papers don't get cited all that much. Sometimes papers get very heavily cited, kind of fortuitously and not always because they're the very best papers that you've done. There's never going to be a perfect correlation between what you think is your best paper and which ones get cited the most. But by and large, we should all want our papers to be read by other people and not consider the publication event itself to be the end of the road. So I would encourage you to think about publication in this way, to plan for strategies around helping people to find your paper and to read your paper. Create strategies for that before the publication event itself. Ultimately, if people don't read your paper, you kind of wasted your time, right? You know, it's often said if it hasn't been published, it hasn't been done. Well, if it hasn't been read, then it may well not have been done either, right? May as well not have been done either. So if people don't read your paper, then you've wasted your time. We've covered a few of these issues before, and I just want to raise them now in the context of thinking about ensuring people read our papers. Remember that title that we talked about a long time ago? Making sure your title is compelling and memorable, and you know, is something that is going to command attention when people are scanning through lists of tables of contents, or you know, they have alerts sent to their emails, or they're doing Web of Science searches or library searches or whatever. Make sure the title of your paper is compelling. And think about other titles. You may have other titles or headlines that you can use in social media posts or blogs or other venues where you have much more latitude and freedom over what your title might be. Think carefully about titles for those kinds of ways of showcasing your work as well. So you can do something much more adventurous or provocative or silly when you're thinking of titles for social media or other kind of avenues for your paper. So get a good title, make sure you've done that. Again, don't think of a title at the last minute before you submit your paper. So with the abstract, goes along with that. Make sure your abstract is the best it can possibly be. And you know, read your abstract and think about it, edit it in the light of, if this was all I read in this paper, would I be, you know, fully furnished with all of the important information about your paper? The sad reality is, and many of you will experience this when you're reading the literature, the abstract is often all we read. And at the very least, it may be the determiner of whether we go on and read a paper in full or not. But make sure the abstract is the very best it can be. So often I read abstracts and you sort of think, I kind of get the general idea, but I don't actually really know what you discovered, or, you know, just make sure it's very clear. And try to work strategically to get your paper read. Don't just be passive. Don't just publish it and then sit back. Try to do some active things. And the range of active things you could do is really only limited by your imagination, right? At the very least, here's a few very obvious and sort of simple recommendations of things you can do. Send your paper to people you know. The very first people that should know about your paper are the people right around you, people in your research group, people in your department or school, people in sort of special interest email groups that you might be involved with in, you know, that cover the disciplines that your paper's published in. Send them to people that you know. Colleagues that you work with who maybe not have been involved with that particular paper, but might be interested in it. And don't just write kind of horrible blanket emails around the place. You know, try to sort of think carefully about different avenues that you can use to disseminate your paper. There may be a few people who you don't actually already know, who you think, maybe you've got a dual purpose in mind. Maybe you want to kind of impress them, but also you want them to know about your paper. Now, be judicious with this. Don't just pick the 500 most famous scientists of all time and send it to them. Choose carefully selected people who are, you know, leaders in the field in which your paper is published. And there may be, it could be 1 or 2, or it may be 10, it may be more, but carefully selected people that you think might be interested in the paper that you've published. And think carefully, don't overdo it. But you may want to send it to them and say, you know, use a bit of flattery, why not? I've been a fan of your work, and particularly enjoyed your recent paper in blah, blah, blah. I thought you might be interested in this paper that's just come out that tackles this particular aspect of this problem I know you're interested in, right? So you might want to use your paper as an opportunity to inform them that it's been published, but also to strike up a conversation with them about their work and your work, and who knows where conversations like that might lead. And think about also other channels, right? I'm an aging dinosaur. Many of you are younger than me and more connected in social media and online. And there's all sorts of heaps of opportunities for publicising and circulating work online through blogs and social media and so on. In the old days, before we all sat behind screens, we used to go to conferences. And that's obviously another way of presenting your work, is at conferences. And conferences are good for sort of hot topics and for work that's underway, but it's also really good to be able to refer to published, very recently published work in conference presentations, so people can actually see the paper, you know, use the paper that you're talking about directly. So think about ways that you can present your recently published work at conferences and show people how they can use that work in terms of their work. Think of, you know, develop an elevator pitch for your paper. Right? No, we recently published a paper doing blah, 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 blah. What's your elevator pitch? You know, can you do that? Think of ways in which you can talk to people about the work that you've done. This stuff's hard, and it's a lot harder for some people than others. It obviously depends on your character. Pick and choose amongst this menu for things that might work for you. Social media, I've already mentioned. Sometimes papers go a really long way on social media, a surprisingly long way. And when it comes to things like social media, there's probably 2 kind of audiences really. One is that you may wish to target your kind of academic circle of friends and friends of friends, right? Academic networks. Many of us have our Facebook feeds and social media feeds as a kind of uneasy mix of professional colleagues and mates from school and all kinds of different people on these things, but we may wish to use social media to connect with our academic network. That's a very particular kind of social media post. Or we may want to connect with the public at large. Now, that's not going to generate citations necessarily, but the example here was one of our papers on urban green spaces, and we wanted to actually reach the public and get the public thinking about this issue. So we wrote social media material that was aimed at the public rather than at other scientists. Get people you know who are well connected on social media to do some of your bidding for you. Find Wikipedia pages is a kind of an interesting and often neglected one. Wikipedia is pretty heavily used. It's becoming a little bit old-fashioned now, but I think it's quite heavily used actually. And for the most part, pretty reliable. And you may be able to find some Wikipedia pages that are allied to your work and just add your work in. And of course, the beauty of that is you've got freedom to really kind of talk it up and really show how your results can be used. And getting your work on Wikipedia could mean it ends up in student essays all around the world, and professors all around the world read those essays and see the citations to your papers. There's heaps of kind of social networks for scientists around: ResearchGate, Mendeley, Loop, academia. There's heaps of them. They keep getting reformed and taken over by each other, but there's lots out there. Can be a bit tiresome dealing with them all. I kind of think it's worth it just sitting down for, you know, an hour a month or whatever, and just kind of tinkering with these different networks and making sure your information is up to date. Okay, I'm done with what I had to say for the prepared content here. Any further questions at this point raised by the last material? I'll give you a moment to do that. I'm just going to switch over to the other screen share. Okay. I'm going to share the Google Doc screen now and offer a few more thoughts around some of these questions in here. And judging by my track record, I'm going to run out of time pretty quickly. What I'll try to do probably is provide some answers in some other way for some of these, or perhaps we'll arrange yet another session in a few weeks' time. One of the questions that received the most +1s: how do I make my research sound important without overinflating the results? There's one or two people who've worked with me a lot over the years on this call, and you'll recognise that I'm always getting pulled up for this. Arm waving too much, making too much of your results. Now, there's two issues at hand here. The first one is it's important scientifically not to take our conclusions beyond the data, right? That is really important. That's a scientific principle. It's a very serious principle, and I would never recommend making conclusions that go beyond the data. So definitely don't do that. That's illegal in scientific circles and must not be done, and could result in your paper being rejected, right? If it seems like your conclusions go beyond the data. So don't do that. But of course, what this question is getting at is that there's a whole kind of middle ground. You know, how far do I push the sort of importance and utility of my results? There isn't a simple way that I can answer that question, but my general advice is to push as far. You just have to push it as far as you can. And I'm not talking, don't oversell it, but try to think, and I remember talking about this issue, think carefully about the sort of biggest issues that your paper impinges on, and try to articulate some of those important linkages with big topics and big questions in science, or big questions in, you know, practice, or whatever it might be. So try to connect your research with big topics. Some of those connections are going to be a bit more tenuous than others, and you clearly have to evaluate those as you're making them. You know, is this too speculative or too tenuous? And be careful about the language that you use. Don't use definite or causal language in cases where you are basically speculating about the importance of something. Again, this is all a question of balance. Don't overload your paper with speculation. But clearly you need some speculation if you want to suggest ways forward, or, you know, suggest some of the, I don't know, mechanisms, for example, that might be happening. It's kind of all I can say. There isn't any way that I could provide a sort of definitive answer that you could then apply to any paper. And you also have to recognise that we all produce papers of different kinds. Each paper is different. You know, I kind of mentioned this 1 in 20 thing. Maybe 1 in 20 of your papers really reaches a kind of high level and really kind of, you know, slam dunk touches right on a big issue, finds some really elegant results, really, you know, is something of a breakthrough and can be talked about as such. Other papers are different, may have more regional, more local, more narrow disciplinary interest. Most of our papers are like that. So I guess what I'm saying is don't be too eager every single time to get your paper in the highest impact journal. And you can't publish in high impact journals simply through flannel and through selling your results. Again, editors and referees and the entire system is set up to spot that and to sort of root it out. But I'll hear you protest. Well, I've seen heaps of papers in the actual literature that do that. Well, maybe sometimes people get away with it. But, you know, you need good results, you need solid results, and you need to understand what you've done, what you've discovered. You've got to get the basics right. Okay, overcoming language barriers for non-English scientists and readers of work. This is a hugely important issue. Tatsuya Romano, who's recently joined UQ as an academic at UQ, is beginning a whole research program on this issue. How do we address and bring down and reduce language barriers in science? He's done some amazing work suggesting that a fairly large proportion of global scientific knowledge is not available for non-English and English. You know, the language is a real barrier to the dissemination of science. And there's a whole number of issues in here that I can't really touch on. And also, you know, I'm afraid I'm a typical, you know, I only speak English, and although I work with a lot of people who don't have English as their first language, personally, you know, the experience of those who do not have English as their first language will be more useful than anything I've got to say about it. So ask someone who doesn't have English as their first language about that. But I will offer a few thoughts. The first is when we write, and the first is to say that if you are a scientist who does not have English as your first language, I would like to tell you something that I think is really important. That in my experience of supervising a large number of people over a large number of years, whether English is your first language or not has zero correlation with the quality of your science. And I really mean that. It has zero correlation with the quality of your science. Whether you're a good scientist or not is about how well you think, not about how well you speak different languages. And the same applies actually to the quality of your writing. This might sound hard to believe, but it is my observation from where I stand. I think very often people without English as their first language often actually end up writing in a clearer, more logical, more compelling way than people with English as their first language, because often the language is more direct and more carefully sort of thought through, if you like, and not just kind of splurged out. So please don't feel that there is an automatic relegation of your work. That's not to say that there are not enormous barriers for people without English as their first language in science. There absolutely are barriers, and clearly it's important to work with people who can help you push through those barriers and overcome them. So I'm trying to offer, I think, a message of hope, but I'm also offering a recognition that it is difficult for people without English as their first language. And it can be especially difficult in the paper submission phase. I mean, at the end of the day, if you want to finesse your writing, the very fine detail of the writing, you may need to work with English editing, you know, and working with people who can do some of that at the late stages. But the bottom line is the basic science, the basic structure, the fundamental structure of your paper and your writing and your thinking does not depend on language. Secondly, when we write papers, we need to make our papers as accessible as possible for as diverse an audience as possible. That doesn't just apply to people without English as their first language. It applies to everybody. Better language is more simple language. Better language is more direct language that has simple sentence structures and simple forms. And that's not to be patronizing to readers. That is to help. Remember, good scientific writing is about you transferring your thoughts that are inside your head into the thoughts of somebody else, right, into their head. And you need to put up as few barriers as possible. And that I prefer to, when I'm reading English, I prefer for that English to be simple. I prefer for that English to be, to use simple words and to be structured simply. As simple words as possible and as simply structured as possible. Okay, so again, I hope that's a source of, you know, I hope reassurance, but it's also a challenge for all of us to not get tempted to make our scientific writing complicated and convoluted and impressive. It doesn't work, and it's often counterproductive. What do you do to get into the mood of writing? Someone's posted something there. Take a look at that. This is a very difficult one, right? I mean, personally, for me, I guess my life, my career stage now is perhaps different to many of you listening here. For me now, I'm extremely regimented about it. I program time into my diary when I'm going to look at something, and I just do it then. And if I've got something to write, I just do it in some time that I previously allotted to it. I don't think about it. I don't ask whether I feel like doing it. I just do it and get through each of the, you know, each day. I don't even make decisions about what I do on a given day. Those decisions have already been made previously. And on any given day, I just go through the appointments in my diary. Some of them are meet other people, but some of them are sit and work on this paper. And I just kind of do it, whether I want to do it or not. It's a bit different when you're creating something. It can kind of be hard to know how long it's going to take, how much time you need to devote to it. I guess we'll all have our different strategies for that. And I guess you just have to try to sort of build strategies that work for you. What I do know and do remember from earlier stages in my career is that I think it's like, I think two strategies for me. The first one was just keeping going at it, because sometimes it feels like you're not getting anywhere because you're not accumulating words on a page, but time spent thinking and wrestling with it is actually time that needs to be spent, right? So maybe it's recognizing sometimes that wrestling with something, although you may not be accumulating words, is actually time. It has to be done. You've got to work through it in your mind to get it to the stage where you can write more down. And secondly, I suppose the sort of converse of that, putting something down for a bit and giving yourself time to think about something else, and then go back to it. There's a few more nice things appearing on chat. I mean, clearly a lot of people sort of struggle with this a little bit, and it's very hard for me to provide sort of generic advice that's going to be useful for everybody around this. Involving other people in what you're doing is perhaps also a useful strategy. If you're the sort of person that responds to deadlines, could you agree a time that your supervisor is going to look at your work and then basically promise to send whatever you've got by that date? Right? I mentioned that as a strategy. Perhaps you could try that if you're the sort of person that responds to deadlines. But maybe you're not a deadline person, and maybe that will stress you out even more. So think through those things. I would say overwhelmingly, and somebody's touched on this in the chat, is you've got to be kind to yourself. You really do. I think one of the real dangers in science is that it's easy to get pretty lonely pretty quickly. Often you may feel like you're the only person that cares about the thing you're doing, and you're sort of alone, trying to create this paper out of somewhere. And you may be frustrated with yourself. You might be, engaging in destructive or not very useful self-talk, right? So watch for those things, I think, and be really careful about that. And again, involving other people in your sort of journey could be a really good way of doing that. There's this journal club been recently set up in our department, and just ways of sharing some of those things could be really useful. But you do have to be kind to yourself and be patient with yourself. Okay. Should you always attempt to publish in highest impact journals first? Can rejection in one impact chances of publication in another? As a general rule of thumb, I think you should generally try to publish each paper in the most prestigious. I think I would use the word prestigious rather than high impact, in the sense that prestige is a bit broader than simply impact factor. In general, I would go for the most prestigious journal you can for an individual paper. The second part of this question may be referring to well, first of all, rejection from one journal doesn't really intersect with the decision-making of another journal. Journals are editorially independent from each other, and this is the case even within publishing groups. Nature Publishing Group, for example, unless you consent to transfer between journals, unless you explicitly consent to that, there is editorial independence between editorial teams of different journals, even within the same stable. So unless, at least this is my understanding, and I know this is true for the Nature Publishing Group. So unless you consent to it, one editorial team will not know about the editorial history of your paper with other journals. There's a second issue here, that you will rapidly get a bad name for yourself if you send every paper to Nature, right? And remember that journals are edited by human beings, most of them, and that human being is a human being and will be forming opinions. So be a bit judicious. Don't go ridiculous for every paper, but do, I think, I suggested a general rule of, a good journal plus one. Have a go, push the boundary. You never know, but don't take it too far. So don't worry about rejection. Rejections do happen, and if you get rejected, you shouldn't feel, oh, I've kind of burnt a credit there with that journal. It doesn't really work like that. As long as you're honest and sensible about your journal choices each time, everybody knows that's the game we're in. You know, it's rough and tumble, it's a bit of a fight, rejections happen, and you know, we're all engaged in this process of publishing. Editors understand it, reviewers understand it, we all understand the dimensions of the game. Just sort of play it carefully and judiciously. In the last 1 minute, how do I organise my ideas? What's the best way to start a paper? You will, of course, as you get into a research, this is going to vary a bit by discipline. In some incredibly experimental, kind of very clearly defined pieces of work, there won't be so much latitude for sort of worrying about it or what all the ideas are. If there's more uncertainty, sometimes papers and projects change a bit as you go through them, and you need a kind of careful think about how you're going to angle papers. And really for any paper, you do need to be thinking about how you're going to pitch it, and that affects the sorts of ideas that you bring in and so on. My advice is the best way to start a paper, I've found the best way to start a paper is with the results section, because often that's the least equivocal part of your paper. Results are what your results are, and if you begin with that, that I think can give you a very clear steer about what your paper shows, which is the most important place to start. What does your paper actually, what do your results actually show, first of all? Then there's the sort of second order question of, well, how do I couch that? How do I pitch that? How do I discuss that? Those are then second order and depend on the core business of what the results show. So if you're feeling confused, and you will be, I don't know of any paper that's ever been written where no one has felt confused along the way and disorientated. Just because papers look perfect when they're done, that doesn't mean they were just written out word for word perfect on the first go. They never are, right? So it's always difficult. It's always organic. You often have to change your mind. You often have to change the structure. Sometimes you'll get quite near the end and think, oh, I'm going to have to redo this. I can see a better way of organising it now. And that's the way it is. Beginning with the results gives you a solid basis, but it doesn't mean that you won't have to make changes later on. That's one piece of advice I can give. And I think secondly, this, as a psychological strategy, just try not to get too frustrated if things do change and if you need to reorganize things. And as I mentioned earlier, sometimes starting it, not necessarily starting again, but even beginning a section again or a paragraph again can be a good way of doing it. And that final key, that the delete button is your most important friend on the keyboard. If you're struggling to express something, one of the possible reasons for that is perhaps that it doesn't belong. So try deleting it and actually seeing if that helps clarify things. Sometimes people struggle for ages with individual sentences and end up realizing that the reason I'm struggling is because it doesn't even fit, it doesn't even belong here. And actually I can just delete it and the whole thing is a lot better. Okay. I'm going to finish up here. I don't want to overrun too much, and I might perhaps record something that covers some of these remaining questions from here and disseminate that on the YouTube channel. So I want to thank you all for devoting time to this and for sharing your thoughts and ideas in the chat with each other. I'm sorry that the format is kind of, it's a talking head. It's me talking at my screen and you. I do hope it's been useful. If people have ideas for future sessions, perhaps more interactive opportunities or things you'd like to do, especially those at UQ, but also people elsewhere. And do drop me a line with those, and we can think about those. I think as often as scientists, we don't talk much about the process of doing science, and I think we should. It's not a secret. It's not a secret club. I can't speak for others, but I'm sure it's true. You know, I want there to be lots more scientists, and I want you all to be successful in your careers and to you know, find ways to break through some of the barriers that are in place in science and in the way we do science. So thank you for giving your time. Thank you for your wonderful comments. It's very heartening. And I'll finish this session here, and you will see more on the YouTube channel and Facebook page and elsewhere. Thank you very much, everybody. Now it's the awkward pause while I end the meeting. Yeah, great. Thanks. Bye.